Hey, welcome back, guys. Okay, so congratulations on the progress you've made so far in your journey to learning JavaScript. You've really made some more progress than you realize. Okay, so look at all that we've covered. We've looked at variables, we talked about data types, talked about operators, and we even went ahead to talk about conditional statements. All right, so these are really the fundamentals of not just JavaScript but programming generally. So yeah, you should be really proud of yourself. Now, the next thing on this outline is loops. But before we talk about loops, I want us to take a step back to data types and talk about something very important. And the reason is because when we talk about loops, we're going to be needing the concept, a particular concept in data types, which is why we need to, discuss it. Now, the data types we talked about are this, and I remember I mentioned they are categorized under primitive data types. Primitive data types is basically the most basic form of data representation. So number, string, boolean, null, undefined, these are primitive data types. It doesn't get any more basic than that. Now we have the non-primitive data types, which we want to look at, arrays and objects. So we want to look at them and then move forward to loops. Okay, so arrays and objects. Arrays and objects are non-primitive data types. They are non-primitive because they are a composition of primitive data types, usually some sort of collection of primitive data types. So that's why we call them non-primitive, and they are very essential. So let's talk about arrays first. So, so arrays are basically ordered lists of items. Now, these items can be any data type. So the way you represent arrays is with an angle bracket. Okay, so this is a representation of array, and then you can have items go inside it, which are basically data. Let's take for instance, so let's say you want to, let's imagine you are building a game application. Okay, and you have a score, you have a way of showing the player score at the end of a particular game. So you could present it with say let's score. Now this is one of those cases where you want to use let because score is something that you may want to update with time. Yeah, so initially you start with a score of 0, and as the game progresses, as the student or as the player scores points, you increment score. So you want to basically down the line in your programming or in your code, you're going to be reassigning different values to the score variable. So it's one of those cases where you initialize with let. Okay. So let's say the score is 0 initially, and then after some time, you can have score, or maybe at the end of the game, the score is, let's say the highest score a person can score on the game is 10. So let's say the person scores 7. Okay. So just for simplicity's sake, so let's say score is 7, right? Now, this is a valid JavaScript statement. It's a variable declaration and assignment. So we declare variable score and we assign a value 7 to it. Now, this is okay. So let's say you are dealing with let's say you want to collect the scores of a particular player over time. So let's say that this player has played this game a couple of times and you want to collect his scores together, group his scores together so that you can do something like get their minimum score, maybe for analytics purpose, get their minimum score or show their highest score or get their average score over time. So in that case, having just one value score is not going to cut it. So you're going to need a way to put all their scores over time together. So you're going to need an array in that case. So we can say let's user scores scores, and then you assign it to an array. Now, this is a valid JavaScript statement. So this would be a case where the array is empty. So basically the user has not played any game. So basically they don't have any scores yet. So you can have empty arrays. So but let's say the user has played like 5 times. So the first time, let's say they had a score of 5, and then they had a score of 8, and then they had a score of 7, then they had a score of 4, okay, and then they had a score of 9. Okay, so this is an array of scores of the user, and this is what we mean by array, a collection, an ordered list of items. Okay, so there are some important terms to understand when you are dealing with arrays. The first is element, and then the second is length, and then index. So first, element. Element is the individual item that are separated by comma. So the comma separated items is what we call the elements of an array. Now, the number of elements in an array is what we call the length. So this is an array of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So this is an array of 5 elements. So we say the length of this element is 5 because there are 5 elements in it. It's also important to note that each of those elements have their own specific data type. Okay, so um, it, um, yeah, each of the elements has their own specific data types, and what it means is that you can have an array where the elements are all of data type number, like we have here. It can also be an element where all the data types are all the elements have data type of strings. So we can say um, let's okay, we can say const days. So here we can have an element of days of the week. So here each of the elements is a string: Monday, Tuesday, uh, Wednesday, and so on. So we can also have an element where we can also have an element where that is mixed. So we can also have an array where the elements are of mixed data type. So this this can be true, this can be false, basically. So each of the comma separated item in an element is an array, so it can be of any data type. Okay, all right. Now we want to talk about index. So we've talked about elements, we've talked about length. Let's talk about index. So index is the specific position associated with a specific element in an array. So remember we said arrays are ordered lists, ordered lists of items. This is where the order comes from. Each element of an array has a unique position associated with it. That unique position is called index. So that is where the index comes from. And this is very, very important. Now, the way it works is the first element has an index of 0. And typically, programming generally counting starts from 0. And this is a typical use case, a typical example. So um, the first element has an index of 0. The second element has an index of 1. The third element has an index of 2, and so on and so forth. So you can always predict that the last element of an array will always have an index of the length of the array minus 1. I hope that makes sense. Okay, so this will always be the index of the last element of the array. Okay, so that is a very, very high level overview of arrays. So Of course, we're going to come back to talk about arrays in details. There's still a lot to talk about arrays, but I mean, I don't want to overwhelm you with a lot of information at once, so we'll take it one step at a time. Now, let's talk about objects. Um, so objects are basically collection of key value pairs. Okay, so let's take for instance, let's say I have name, or let's say first name, for instance. I'm thinking of a person. So typically, when you're programming, think of user. This is a typical piece of data in a program. So so users will have things like first name and say Max. Hold on. I think I have first name defined somewhere here already. So yeah, so let me comment that out. So first name, and in case you're wondering how I do this, commenting is something that um, you use to um, describe or to specify a part of your code that you don't want to execute. So you can always comment it out. So it's not going to get executed. I'll probably talk more about commenting later, but that is what I do. The way you comment in JavaScript, so if you want to comment out one line, just hold your command if you're on Mac and then press /. If you want to uncomment a particular line, so like you want to make it available again for execution, you do the same thing. So just toggle between comment and uncomment and just the same command and /. If you're on Windows, I think it should be control /. Okay, so that's what I did. First name is Max. So let's say age. So let's say age is 23, and then let's say gender. Of course, these are variable declarations, so don't forget your const keyword. I have all of these already, so I'm just gonna have to comment them out here, and I'll probably, okay, this is fine. These three are fine. So gender is male. Okay, so I have this. Now, let's say you are, let's say all of these pertain to one user. All of these attributes, first name, age, gender, let's say they all pertain to one user. Because they are all data that is associated with a particular user, you can group them together inside a single entity called object. So object is how you encapsulate data that are related, right? So that's what object is for. And the way to represent it is with a curly bracket, just like this. Remember that arrays is square bracket, object is curly bracket. So you can have a variable and assign that variable. So you can say user and assign it to an object, and this object will encapsulate the attributes of that particular user, or something we call properties of that particular user. Okay, so um, we can now put this together. So we can say first name. Remember that this is a variable name that you assign the value max. So you can have first name and you can say max, and then you can say age, and you can say 23, and then we can also have gender, and you can say male. So we can now get rid of all this. So we now have a single object that holds all of these values associated with this user. Now we say that user is an object, okay? And this is the syntax for creating an object. Now, each, you also have comma. You see, you also have each entity separated by comma. So we say that there we have key value pair. So each of what we have here separated by comma is a key value pair, where key is the name, and then we have the value. We can also call it properties. So this is the property. So the key value pair is the properties of the object. So this object has how many properties? One, two, three. The first property is first name. Second property is age. And third property is gender. And remember that the values are the actual data that we are storing, the values of each property, which is this. So this is more like a reference. The name is more like a reference to the actual value that is being stored. I hope that makes sense. And the syntax is the key or the name first, followed by colon, and then you have the value. Now remember that this value can be of different data types. So let's add one more property here. So let's say it's adult, and then we are going to have, anyway, it does not really matter because I'm going to explain to you why. Now we are going to say true. Now if we had said is adult here, so if you say const is adult, and then we say true, so it's going to flag it that there's an error, and this is because we are trying to um, declare a variable that we've already declared as const. So we can't do that. But how come we are able to do that here? The reason is because adult here is not existing as an independent variable on its own. It's existing as a property of an object. So the variable here is user. So everything else here are properties of the user object. I hope that makes sense. Excuse me. Okay. So how do we assess the properties of an object? Or yeah, how do we assess the properties of an object? To do that, just like arrays, we can also assess each of the individual elements of an array. So let's talk about that first. So to assess each of the individual elements of an array, um, you know what? Let's stick with object. Go back to arrays. So to assess the properties of an array, there are two ways to do that. So we have what we call the dot notation, and then we also have the brackets notation. Okay, so let's say we want to access the value that is stored in the first name property of the array. We use the bracket notation. We use the dot notation first. So, and the way we do it is we say user, that is the user object, dot first name. You see, so this gives us the value that is stored in the first name key. So when we deal with object properties, we use key and name interchangeably. So we can say the key or the property name or the property key, it's all the same thing. So if we say console.log and we log this guy, let's inspect. So we check our console. What's wrong? Console.log user the first name. Is there a reason why this doesn't log anything to the console? Okay, we're getting an error here that says gender is not defined. Where are we using gender? Gender is not defined. Of course, we are logging gender here, but we are logging gender here, but we didn't define it. So I'm going to just get rid of it. Okay, so what is going on here is this one rule in variables. Um, we are trying to access a variable before we defined it. You see, gender here is commented out, so our program does not recognize it. Now we are saying console.log gender. So we're making a reference to a variable. We actually have a variable called gender down the line in our program. Um, where is it? Actually, none. We don't have anyone. Okay, first of all, where are we getting this error? On line 35. And this is line 35. Oh, okay. So it's trying to make a reference to gender, and there's no gender variable, so we're gonna just get rid of it. Um, I think for the purpose of simplicity's sake, I think we better get rid of all the codes, or at least comment them out. Okay, all the codes we no longer are using, let's comment them out, including this one and this one and this one. So we save and check again. Good. We get max logs to the console. So it's coming from line 27, which is this. So user.first name. The same thing if you want to get user.age. So get 23. And if you want to get user.is_adult, and we get true. Okay, so we see user.is_adult is true. And so basically, this is the dot notation. You type the user, you follow with a dot, and then you follow it with a property that exists on the user. It has to exist. If I do user.height, it's going to say undefined because there is no property called height in this user object. Okay. But it is also possible to dynamically add a property to a user. So we can come here and say user dot height, and then we say 1.7. Okay. Now, if we do console.log user.height, let's see what we get. You see 1.7, and that is because we have added height property here, even though we didn't explicitly add it inside the object as one of the properties. We added it here programmatically, like dynamically. So it is possible to update an object. So we say that objects are mutable. We can mutate objects, which means we can basically alter the content of an object. Okay, so that is something to keep in mind. So let's talk about the bracket notation. The bracket notation doesn't make use of dots, it makes use of brackets. So when you type the user or the variable that you assign to the object, and then you follow it by a square bracket, and then you follow it with quotes, and then specify the property you want to access. Okay, so first name like this. So this is going to also give you the first name. So we know that we can say user dot first name, or we can say user first name. These are the same. So whichever one you prefer is fine. So, but for convenience, um, it's always easier to use the dot notation. I mean, it makes the code a lot neater, and it's a lot more convenient in terms of typing, in my opinion. Okay, so that's that about objects. Now, an object can, a property of an object can even be an array, like the value. So for instance, you can say scores, right? So you want to put the scores of this user, it can be an array, and then you can have 4, you can have 8, you can have 9, you can have 5. You see? So the properties of an array of an object, or the value can be an array. It can be any data type, or it can even be another object. Okay, so it can be another object, like we can say address. Okay, so we can say address, Okay, so address can be an object, and it can have things like city. The city can be, let's say, Lagos. Okay, so you can have something like street number. Street number can be, it can be a number, so we can say 241 or 241. Okay, so basically, you get the idea. So the value that is assigned to an object property can be any data type. It can be a primitive data type, like we have number. Um, it can be a non-primitive data type like an array or even another object. So you can see we can have nested objects. Okay, and if you want to access the properties of any of this, you can always do that. For instance, if we wanted to access, if we say console.log, let's say user dot address. So it's going to give us another object, which inside this object we will have city and street number. So if you look at this, we see we get an object. City is Lagos, street number is 241, and we can even access the property of the nested object. So if you want to access, for instance, dot city, right? In this case, it's going to give us Lagos. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. Um, Now, if we continue to add properties to this object, you see it gets longer and longer. We just keep scrolling horizontally, which is not a good developer experience. So we can make our object properties span multiple lines. Basically, we can do this. Can bring each property on its own line, like this, and like this, and like this. Okay. I mean, even the nested objects, the properties of the nested objects can also span their own lines, and just like that. Okay, you see, this is our object now, and we don't have to, do a horizontal scroll. Everything is just at a glance. Okay, now let's talk about how we can access the properties of an array. Actually, not properties, it's elements. Now, to access the elements of an array, we use the index, right? Because each element has a unique position, which is the index, and we can access the element by that index. Now, objects do not have unique position. The properties of an object don't have any uniqueness to their position. The order doesn't matter. That's what I mean. And so we can access using the property name or the property key. But for arrays, it's just the elements and their position. So to access the first element of an array, we reference the array by name. So let's say we want to access the first score. We'll say console.log. Actually, let's say user score, and then we follow it by a square bracket, and then we follow it by the index of that particular element. So this will get us the element on index 0, which is the first element. So if we say console.log and we put this, it should get us the element in the first position, which is 5. All right. If we do um, 7, so which means we are looking for the element at index 7. Now the last index, this element has an array, or this array, sorry, this array has an element of 5. So there is no index 7. We have index 0, index 1, index 2, index 3, and index 4. So 4 is the last, 4 is the index of the last element. So if we log this to the console, we're going to get undefined because there's no element with an index of 7. So, but we do have an element with an index of 3, and that is 4. here, and we have an element with an index of 4, and that should be 9. Okay, so that is how you access the elements of an array. This video is already very long. As you can imagine, there's still a lot to talk about in arrays and objects, but I think we've covered most of what we need to, to get started. So, in the next video, we are going to continue with loops, and then maybe subsequently we talk more about arrays and objects. Okay, so I'll see you guys in the next video.